Say for a moment that we were to rate a game on a 1 to 10 scale. There are generally two distinct ways in which we may arrive at our final rating. It either somehow ended up executing everything with perfect consistency and the experience shifted in no way pertaining to any of its aspects, or the more common case, the game was an amalgamation of many pieces with varying levels of quality. Thus, it goes without saying that a game can be both a masterpiece and somewhat bad at the same time. Danganronpa has some of the best mystery writing in games, and yet it's at times frustrating how many plot opportunities the developers miss out on. Darkest Dungeon is, in my opinion, one of the best examples of turn-based combat done right, accompanied by amazing atmosphere, music, voice acting, graphics, class design and so on, yet a gigantic amount of mandatory grind can understandably turn people off. And even pointing at other excellent turn-based games like Dragon Age Origins, its combat ultimately turns boring as you devise a perfect strategy for every situation and proceed to perform it for 80 hours straight, as is custom to expensive role-playing games of course. But enough ranting on Dragon Age for now. It's also not unheard of that the game retains its masterpiece status while having not bad but terrible problems, and by terrible I mean literally in the worst state we've seen them in all of gaming history. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which has its horrific clunky combat system and a plethora of bugs, while also being one of the most immersive, well-written RPGs of all time. World of Warcraft Classic, featuring what is probably the most imbalanced class balance a game has ever had, albeit still providing what I humbly deem the best MMORPG experience out there. And Pathologic Classic HD, a game that has the most boring combat and overall gameplay, an unending amount of bugs and a cryptic, indigestible and impossible to grasp story, whilst also being one of the most ambitious and unique, psychological first-person survival games. However, it's very important to note that these games succeed despite these flaws, not because of them. I am not playing Danganronpa for these annoying plot moments. A lot of people play Darkest Dungeon despite the grind. I am not playing Dragon Age or Bloodlines for the combat. Most people aren't playing WoW Classic because it offers a fair class experience. And I assure you no sane person is playing Pathologic for the gameplay. We should also mention that these problems are not so easy to solve either. Danganronpa's story is heavily intertwined, and thus changing one thing, at least to me, feels almost impossible. Darkest Dungeon would lose its feeling of oppression if it was shorter, and Dragon Age's boring combat fundamentally comes from its system's existence and not from the system's execution. Also, VTMB's release was forcibly rushed. Classic was the one who started it and therefore had much to perfect down the road, and Pathologic is, well, a Russian game. And yet, this game that I'm going to be discussing today has problems which don't fall in either of the aforementioned categories. In this game, A, you are in a way forced to play the game for these aspects, and B, some of these problems can be solved by a second grader with third-rate common sense, or in other words, they're really fucking easy to solve. It's very likely that, similar to me, you also get incredibly frustrated at the sight of a game that is great, yet also has the potential to be even better, and not really at a great cost of effort. If this idea truly irritates you, then you'll likely have a great, yet frustrating time with Darkwood. I'd like to start off by explaining the three major problems I have with the game, after which I'll be diving into its fundamentals before eventually reaching the story itself. I want to note that, while I hate the game in some ways, in no way do I hate the whole experience. Darkwood is amazing, and if you're about to live in fear of spoilers, then I humbly request that you give it a try. Speaking of spoilers, I will be discussing the gameplay and mentioning the areas, characters and enemies as we progress towards the spoiler section. While I did make a considerable effort to spoil the least I can about the gameplay, as this game is best experienced blind pertaining both to the story and the gameplay as well, I will inevitably end up spoiling something, I'm sure. So beware, I guess. First off, the majority of the game will be reviewed through the lens of normal mode, since that's what I, and likely you, played on in your first playthrough. I also completed the game on hard mode afterwards, but that'll be discussed at the end of the video. For now, let's pretend like I haven't done that yet. Anyway, in any other game I'll usually wonder for a minute or so whether I should go with normal or hard, and regardless of what I choose, I am usually left quite satisfied with my playthrough, difficulty wise at least. However, that isn't the case with Darkwood. There is a major problem in the form of a tremendous difficulty spike between normal and hard. One is an incredibly easy, chill experience, and the other is a very punishing hardcore mode. There is literally no in-between. Now, many games have had this problem in the past, but it usually isn't the biggest deal breaker in the world. With Darkwood though, upon further inspection, this seems to prevent an opportunity for the most stressful, horrific, unique, one-in-a-lifetime experiences you can have in all of gaming. But in order to understand why, and most importantly how that is, we need to inquire shortly about Darkwood's genre. Darkwood is marketed as a survival horror game. However, don't let that fool you. That's a complete lie. Well, kind of. Let me explain. Survival horror these days is usually associated with games in which you're tasked with, be it through avoiding or outsmarting, ultimately surviving an individual threat. A terrifying alien hunting you through the narrow hallways of a dim, broken spaceship, an assortment of crazed lunatics, each more demented than the previous, making your life hell as you try to escape from an abandoned mental asylum, or a bunch of nightmarish, horrific beings chasing you to the dark and empty hallways of Burdenberg Castle. This idea of survival horror can be traced back as far as 100 years ago to H.P. Lovecraft, who popularized the formula of a protagonist coming face to face with something unimaginable, unexplainable, invulnerable, and thus, ultimately, something they can only run away from. However, survival horror was not always associated with such an abstract concept. Today, pretty much everything can be titled survival horror, but it used to be a very particular distinct formula, and one kind of opposite of the idea of escape or be killed. Kill or be killed. In this formula, coined by the Resident Evil franchise and later adopted for the Silent Hill series and various other titles, you are made to feel, albeit powerless to an extent because of your lack of ammo, health and vision, still in control in a way, since combat is at least an option. Fighting your way through a sea of uncanny twisted monsters in a fog-ridden and paranormal town, or a herd of mindless zombies infesting Raccoon City's police station. Although these games are clearly very much different than modern survival horror, they still employ a lot of the same elements, taking an emphasis on puzzle solving, a feeling of powerlessness due to your lack of resources, and at times implying that it might be better to just run, especially when you're being chased by an invulnerable enemy. So, does Darkwood bring back that old school style of survival horror? No, it's actually not a survival horror game by either of these definitions. It is a survival game, which also happens to be a horror game. The closest and really only match I can think of is The Forest. It's structured as an open world survival game and each of its elements is painted with the brush of horror. Thus, if you strip both of these games down to their core, they're more similar to Don't Starve or Minecraft than they are to Amnesia or Outlast. This combination of genres sounds like such an ordinary idea, but I can't even begin to express just how masterful this merge is, and most importantly, why it manages to conjure one of the most horrifying experiences you can have with a video game. But I will try. This is because in Darkwood, the real fear derives just as much and maybe even more from the survival rather than the horror. To put it simply, in other horror games you fear dying, which is a process, but in Darkwood you fear death, which is a permanent state. After all, you only have a limited amount of lives. Thus, it also causes a unique type of fear which never really lets go. In Outlast you get scared, sure, and you might dread the jump scares to come, but you can always turn it off and continue later when you're sounder of mind. And dying is usually a sweet release anyway, as you respawn quickly after with no real repercussions at all. Meanwhile, if you die in Darkwood, direct consequences follow every single time. And if you turn it off, you're still pondering, am I going to survive scavenging next time? Am I prepared for the following night? Do I have enough lives? This lingering sense of fear also works on a much smaller scale. After getting properly jump scared in Outlast, you get a moment to reconcile and calm down and then continue playing. And you grow more and more fearless the further you get and the end of it all approaches. Whilst in Darkwood, that terrible dread lingers at the back of your mind for what seems like hours, festering throughout the whole experience as you stare at your dwindling amount of precious lives and finally letting go only moments before the credits roll. You don't get to calm down at the end. You never truly know if you're going to make it, and thus the progression of stress does not tread downwards but rather upwards. This breed of high-stakes, stressful gameplay experience can be well experienced by simply turning on any permadeath or limited life difficulty in a moderately long game, but only in Darkwood is it paired with an equally amazing horror counterpart, which is what ultimately lets it flourish into such a unique experience. So how the hell is this related to the difficulty problem again? Well, the various difficulties are as follows. Normal, where you drop your items on death and have to walk back and get them. Hard, where everything is the same but you have 4 lives. And Nightmare, where you have life 1 instead, and after that, it's pretty much over. Do you see where I'm going with this? Yeah, this merge of survival and horror I just spent so much time praising, it just isn't there during normal mode, as one of its pieces is missing, the survival. By that I mean you don't really need to survive, as death is almost never punishing. The survival and the horror must go hand in hand, so by eliminating the need to survive, you retroactively eliminate the uncomfortability of horror. Normal mode is more or less a story mode. If you die during the day, you lose some time running back to your items, and if you die during the night, you get no reputation with the trader, the NPC that provides you precious items for said reputation. And the latter doesn't really mean anything at all. You will most certainly have an excess of items most of the time, especially if you're playing on normal, since you'll also be incentivized to take larger risks when scavenging for resources. 250 is the most reputation you can lose with the trader on death, and that's very late in the game. Meanwhile, pretty early on, I amassed a total of 14 shiny stones, which comes out to a whopping 1820 reputation, and I had absolutely nothing to buy from the trader except the usual mushroom, red egg, gasoline, scrap metal and rags, which is easily covered with your daily reputation anyway, and if not, you can still keep useless items like excess staffs, one-shot pistols and shotguns, etc. That's the main reason I always had so many shiny stones. Why even sell them when I have other things to get rid of? And that's in part what I was using the trader for, a garbage disposal for the items I simply couldn't make space for, more on that later. Yes, there were some items I lacked, wood after moving hideouts, rags after making too many lanterns and torches, scrap metal after repairing my shovel even when it's at 70% durability, and alcohol after not realizing the bikeman drinks it all when transporting your items. But besides that, I always had too many items. While playing normal mode, it's harder to inventory manage than to actually survive. It's too carefree, and it takes away from the whole point of the game, the dread. Unfortunately, you can't really play hard mode on your first playthrough. I mean, you can give it a try, there's no barrier saying complete normal mode first, but you likely won't make it further than the second zone if you do give it a try. I did and got about 5 hours in before I met my end, and a playthrough can get up to 25 hours if you take your time and explore everything. There's also a huge difficulty spike about halfway through the game as well. I went from dying once every 5 days to dying 2 times in a row. I am not a god gamer, and I'm pretty sure I'm a little slower at picking up a game than most people in fact, but I don't shy away from hard games really. I even go out of my way to sometimes make it harder, like beating Dark Souls 3 and its first DLC on Soul Level 1. I am not that bad at games, and I found this game to be incredibly unforgiving at times. So, don't go with hard mode, the only truly engaging mode, on your first playthrough. You can probably manage it by googling strategies on how to avoid danger, which will likely result in you spoiling yourself something, but even if you do know the ins and outs of it, you'll still get unlucky, as in certain occasions death can become almost inescapable. Run away from an enemy and step on a trap, dead. Kill a banshee and get cornered by its babies, dead. And my personal favorite, the lights go out and the spirits eat your ass. Dead. Well, it isn't guaranteed death, but it certainly will be if it happens not 2, not 3, but 4 times in a row. Yes, this can actually happen. You can try to dodge them, but being in a small room crammed with traps doesn't help, let alone a room filled with enemies you can't see. I'm about to tell you how to avoid this, so skip to the time shown on the screen if you don't want to hear it. Okay. You are supposed to throw a flare? I mean, how was I supposed to know that? The first instinct for anyone would be to take a lantern or torch out, perhaps throw a Molotov even, but once seeing none of those work, I would expect most people to conclude that a different light wouldn't be the magical solution. And this isn't the only time the game confuses you either. For example, there's a status effect of white color, the universal color of all buffs, and a description stating your skin is thicker. Can you guess what it does? It actually makes you take more damage. Okay, if the game is so hard to beat on, well, hard, the first time around, then why not go with it on your second playthrough? No matter what others say, I firmly believe that the first playthrough will be the most important and likely the only playthrough for the majority of people. The true charm of the game hides in its surprises, and there is no fear of the unknown if you know exactly what resides everywhere and the best way to defeat it. The first time you go to the cornfields, you get scared to death and maybe even get your shit pushed in by some unholy, terrible, barking creature of nightmares. The second time around though, you go to the cornfields and one of the ordinary huge dogs you see so many of throughout the game gets its shit pushed in. You get the idea? To put it simply, if you could play Darkwood on hard mode on your first try, it'd be one of my favorite gaming experiences of all time, literally. The terrible fear of losing your progress coupled with the amazing atmosphere and sheer anxiety induced by entering an area you don't know sounds like pure horrifying bliss. But you cannot have that, and as much as I tried, I couldn't get the same feeling on normal mode. Sure, the monsters are scary, but death isn't, it's just an annoying inconvenience. I can't help but take risks and die since being careful isn't encouraged. After all, you are barely discouraged from dying. Darkwood is a perfect merge of survival and horror, and yet you can only choose one for your first playthrough. Either survive as in actually manage to finish the game, or experience the true horror that the developers conjured for you with such excellence. Now, like anything else, if you criticize something you need to provide a sensible solution. The first one is to make it 4 difficulties. The easy mode would be our current normal mode, the hard and nightmare modes will remain the same, and the new normal mode would be akin to hard but with more starting lives, let's say 8, and a difficult but not impossible way to acquire extra lives, maybe buy one from the trader for 700 reputation. While there is a way to acquire extra lives in our current hard mode, you can only get up to 3 extra lives before the second chapter of the game, and most people won't even figure out how to get them the first time around. Now, the second solution is to be able to tweak hard mode and give yourself extra lives. It's a simple and seemingly stupid solution, but I think people being able to enjoy the other terror that is having lives in a game where everything wants to murder you is better than not having it. You could make it hard mode level 1 where you have 20 lives, hard mode level 2 with 15, hard mode level 3 with 10, etc. As I see it, if I can come up with these solutions, the developers can likely think of something better. And the reason they haven't yet is either they haven't noticed this problem, or the more likely case, they don't even think it's a problem at all. Here's a parting message for this particular issue. I don't think hard mode is bad. In fact, if you look at it as a mode for the returning players, it's actually executed incredibly well. You get just enough lives in the first chapter even without finding all the extra ones, and the fact you can buy them very late in the game is great, since that's where most of the down the other side of the map, die again on the way there, then die when going back after finally getting your items because they don't have enough time in the day to even run there, let alone all the way back, kind of situations happen. I also don't think normal mode is bad either. I'm not one of those elitists who believe that the lower the number of people who manage to finish my favorite game is, the higher the status I feel entitled to becomes. If a game has even an ounce of story, it should probably have a story mode if possible. It makes me incredibly happy that if I somehow convinced one of my relatives to play, say, The Witcher 3, a mode devoid of almost any difficulty is waiting there for them as an option. The real problem is that you have no other option. One is made for the super casual players, and the other one is for the returning ones that beat the game already or the occasional specimen who somehow manages to pull it off. There's easy, or normal, there's hard, but there is no real choice for the normal players. The second major problem you might encounter with this game is ultimately Burnout. This is somewhat related to the previous complaint, as being burned out after your first playthrough on normal means you might decide to never experience the true game on hard. But why might that be? Why could you possibly experience Burnout with such an amazing game? Well, Darkwood is a survival/horror game, but as we already said, it's mostly a survival game with horror elements. You spend the majority of your time exploring, scavenging, and sometimes killing monsters for materials. You craft things so you can scavenge and kill easier. You upgrade your workbench so you can craft more things. You barricade your hideout so you can live through the night and scavenge another day. Thus, Darkwood ends up feeling pretty repetitive overall. It doesn't feel quite complete, in a way that's always been hard for me to explain whenever I look at such a game, really. The survival is not something I would play Darkwood for on its own, and that's bad since that's what the majority of the game is. You do the same stuff over and over, killing the same monsters and looting and bringing the supplies back to your hideout. In short, Darkwood has little replayability. Okay, let me explain. The way I see it, there are 2 ways in which we can judge Darkwood's replayability. One of them is story-wise. When it comes to the plot, Darkwood has some of the best replayability out there. As you're about to see later, there's an absolutely astounding amount of different outcomes for the characters based on your various choices. But what part of Darkwood is making different plot choices again? 10% maybe, if we're being charitable? Everything else is survival, and that has almost no replayability. In fact, it has such little replayability that it managed to bore me at the end of the game before I even begun the replay. The little amount of variety in story you get to experience every playthrough is sandwiched between hours and hours of the same gameplay. And is it really worth it to sit through hours of scavenging, running around and painfully staring at your depleting stamina bar so you can see a different text at the end of the game? And I'm not somebody that hates grinding in games. In fact, I love grinding, but Darkwood managed to grind me down with its gameplay. This lack of variety is obviously an issue, but I guess if you wanted to stretch it, it's also in a way a praise for the developers. Everything that is in the game is done exceptionally well and nothing is half-assed. They could have easily opted for making a more expensive, albeit mediocre game, much like a lot of other developers do, but instead they made a smaller game, wherein the majority of elements are all executed in an excellent fashion. The enemies you fight are all great, the scavenging is mostly satisfying, the nights are always incredibly engaging, and the areas you explore are all somewhat intriguing in their own subtly different way. It is still a problem though. Just because everything is excellent doesn't mean you can use these elements over and over in the same way. The game will slowly become boring, and at the end I found myself even rushing it a little bit, as I already said. In short, it's good to create a small game that's short, or an expensive game that's long, maybe even an expensive game that's short. But it's very hard to pull off a small game that's also long. If you experienced the same boredom at the end, you might have, just like me, concluded at first that the second chapter of the game was simply inferior to the first. But the more I thought of it, the more I realized that simply isn't true. The whole game is undeniably consistent, or if I had to use harsher words, pretty much the same shit all throughout. This is a problem often experienced in longer games, wherein the player feels like the game is slowly declining in quality, but in reality it's an increase in boredom. Another instance of this problem occurring for me recently was Divinity Original Sin 2. While I agree that Divinity's last arc, the City of Arcs, is definitely not as good as the first two and probably on par with the third arc, it still isn't as bad as to explain the absolute zero amount of interest I had for anything going on in the game at the end. We're somehow circling back to turn-based combat once again in a video that's not even about turn-based games, so I'll cut it right there. So yes, Darkwood's gameplay can get pretty boring. For anyone about to say that I'm the problem because I'm ADHD or whatever, here are some of my favorite games of all time that you should keep in mind. The Witcher 3, a game that takes around 90 hours to beat just the main story of the base game and the 2 DLCs. I did all side quests and would have done twice as many. World of Warcraft Classic, I absolutely adore the leveling experience in this game, even though it took me about 360 hours, in no way was it as tedious as most people mentioned. And Pathologic Classic HD, objectively the most boring game in existence. It doesn't help that it's around 24 hours too. The last thing I'm going to say is that if Darkwood induces burnout so fast while also being so much shorter than all of these games, definitely means that there is at least a little validity to my criticism. And no, it being as long as Pathologic is not a good point. The final problem I ran into, which worsened my experience overall, was the storage management. But let's look at the individual inventory management first. You start off with a fairly small inventory with 12 slots and a hotbar with 3 slots. This sounds like a lot, but it greatly decreases whenever you start carrying a melee weapon, several guns, several types of bullets and magazines for said guns, armor, lockpicks, bandages for out-of-combat healing, pills for combat healing, molotovs, stones for hunting rabbits, torches for a cheap source of light, and lanterns for a more expensive source of light which also doesn't require you to hold it in your hand. This can get annoying at times. Going out and slowly walking through the whole map, scavenging for like 1 minute before coming back the same way is just not fun for me. Granted, this is more of a personal trigger I have rather than a horrible decision by the developers, but still, it's good to mention whenever recommending a game. If you hate inventory management, you'll have a problem with this. Luckily, you can upgrade your inventory, but you can only upgrade it a total of 3 times, bringing it up to 18 slots, and your hotbar can eventually reach 7 slots. Still, this decreases again whenever you carry items that don't stack, items that you find too many of, and so on. In order to upgrade your inventory, you need an item called Fabric, which you find way more of throughout the game than you can actually use before reaching the maximum amount of upgrades. Even the upgrade you get from an optional quest isn't special, as you can craft it in a couple of hours anyway. They did this in order to make sure most players that explore at least a little bit can get all the upgrades, but players who do end up exploring everything don't get anything in return. In my eyes, they should have A. made it so that people who do explore and find all the fabrics on their own, some of which are cleverly hidden in ways I won't spoil, do end up being able to use them all. Or B. make it so the people who do explore extensively are the only ones who can attain the current maximum amount of upgrades. Although, there is a way to dispute this criticism of not enough inventory space. You're only supposed to carry one type of melee weapon, one or two types of firearms, one light source, one healing item, and so on. But I think the majority of items were not made to be interchangeable. The axe is for close combat, while the shovel is best suited for open areas, and you also need it for digging anyway. Shotguns are for when the enemy is already next to you, but the hunting rifle is for killing off enemies you wouldn't want to get close to and stun locked by. The torches are for when you need to quickly move to a shrouded part of the woods, and the lantern is for longer and more dangerous explorations wherein you wish to have your finger on the trigger just in case. You get the idea. However, I will note that the amount of inventory space does increase tremendously whenever you get your last skill point, and therefore stop carrying mushrooms and odd meat around. This is very late game though, but still, this isn't the biggest problem in the world. Something that absolutely is the biggest problem in the world, at least to me, is the storage management in your hideout. I mentioned earlier that you'll likely have an excess of items at some points in the game. For me it was the majority of the first chapter and the entirety of the second. While there are small 4 and 8 slot wardrobes in each hideout, the main place you'll be storing your items in is the workbench itself. This is very convenient as you don't have to rummage through various chests in order to find crafting materials, and even more convenient whenever you realize that there isn't an auto sort function. So if I want to find out how many matchsticks I have, I hover over the torch and it says it right there. However, the workbench only has 48 slots, and you can't craft any more chests or increase its capacity in any way. This is just stupid. I enjoy doing simple laborious tasks like filling the generator, cutting wood and boarding up windows after a stressful in-game night, all the while listening to the blissful morning music. What I don't enjoy is sorting items and deciding which ones I need less so I can sell them. This issue is simply annoying, there is no two ways about it, and it takes away from the otherwise satisfying hoarding and collecting of resources. The reason such a minuscule thing ends up being a concerning problem is, like I said, the fact that scavenging is what most of the game is. Thus, any small problem or improvement can end up influencing the experience greatly whenever it's associated with such a major part of the game. Boss quality will affect Dark Souls and Hollow Knight way more than it will affect Crash Bandicoot or Doom. Stealth mechanics will affect Dishonored and Hitman way more than they will Elder Scrolls or Far Cry. And the quality of the plot will affect The Walking Dead and Life is Strange way more than it will Cuphead or Spelunky, and so on and so on. The bigger problem with this, however, is that it's also very easy to solve, which is incredibly annoying. The solution is, just give me a bigger or infinite storage space. When you think about it, you can easily drop your items next to the workbench and they cannot despawn or be destroyed in any way, so why not just give us the convenience of doing that in the workbench? I mean, the whole point of it being a chest is so you don't have to search for crafting materials in other chests, yet you also can't have all the materials there. If not that, then at least let me craft a chest, or better yet, expand the workbench with an upgrade. I don't care if it takes 20 plaques, 30 or 40, I'll still do it. You don't think I will, since I have the complex of saving up everything for an unlikely rainy day in every single game I play? That's true, but this game was too much even for me. I was storing stuff in my wood cutter, specifically planks since they stack better than wood. I was shoving shiny stones not only into cupboards but the corpse of a man I can't mention yet since it's a spoiler, but if you know who I'm talking about then you understand just how severe this really was. That brings me to a little side point, the abundance of some items and the complete scarcity of others. What I'm talking about is exploring the entire map and having 200 nails and 100 boards while also having 2 bottles. This is weird, since you can buy nails and boards but you can't buy bottles. Shouldn't it be the other way around? But I don't want to leave you with the impression that I dislike this game. In fact, it's very far from that. I would say the positives outnumber the negatives. Do they outweigh them? Maybe. But to even begin gauging that, we need to clarify what these strengths are. Most people make sense of the visuals and art direction first, so let's start off with that. You play it from a top-down perspective, which is a pretty unorthodox choice for a horror game. However, it works like a charm because of the game's sight system. You only see in a narrow cone in front of you, which I was surprised to find out was even smaller than real human line of sight. They perhaps went for better than realism. Anything outside this cone can be seen too, but it's darkened and it only appears in the way it appears inside your mind. Think of it like this. You can't see behind you, but you can imagine what's there, say a wardrobe. You might turn around and see a monster next to it, but you can't truly know unless you look at it. And if you hear your wardrobe moving, you can imagine where it's moving to, but not what moves it. The stranger's brain also imagines things which are not there sometimes, thus you can only trust his eyes. The game offers some more realism in the form of blowing faraway objects. I play games to escape the reality of my puny weak eyes that can only see 5 meters in front of me, but you know, that's fine. In all seriousness though, I never really got used to it. I would call it less of a bad feature and more of a personal annoyance, though still kind of a bad feature. If you think about it, in first and third person games, faraway objects being blurred looks natural as they are deeper within your screen. From a top-down perspective, however, they are only far away from your character, and virtually anything that is on your screen is the same distance within said screen. A comedic solution would have been to buy glasses in order to see better. What you do see, however, is so incredibly clean and polished. I have a huge love for indie graphics, and Darkwood has become one of my all-time favorites. Every single little item, enemy, object, and floor pattern, character model and tree are all drawn exceptionally well. You can see the pixels, but it's far from 8-bit games like Celeste. Everything is still very high resolution, kind of like a more detailed version of The Binding of Isaac or Blasphemous. This approach also looks way cleaner than if you were to upscale it, since it makes objects and models really pop out. There is also the color palette. While I'm very curious to see what this art style would look like with a more colorful aesthetic, this is the Darkwood, so it's no surprise everything is mostly black, grey, white, green, yellow or brown. Red shows up occasionally too. The devs called the art style arboreal horror, which I first thought translated to tree horror. For most of the game though, the trees are kind of a metaphor. They close you off from the outside world, monsters skulk in between their tightly hugged trunks, and they appear in the shadows at night. And if there's enough light, you can even see their roots consuming your hideout. But they never take on the spotlight. The idea of a living tree is disturbing, but you're never going to be walking to the forest and get eaten by a tree or have one spring to life and attack you. It's more arboreal horror, as in what lives in the trees horror or something. Speaking of horror, there are no jump scares really, at least no intended ones. In fact, it's the opposite. The most disturbing imagery is usually in the faces of passive characters, the snail, the pretty lady, the sow and the musician. This once again contributes to that lingering fear. I don't remember the first Chris Walker jump scare in the same way that I remember the musician's twisted uncanny figure. But these things are more unsettling than downright scary. Most of the real horror hides in the things that you can't see. The limit of vision is what makes everything so unnerving. You always hear things before you see them. What you do hear is positively harsh, gross, disturbing, and sometimes downright terrifying. However, none of the sounds in this game feel like chalk on the board per se. Well, except for the human spiders. Those are very easy to kill, and the only reason they're scary is because they're always so loud. For the majority though, the game doesn't throw loud sounds at you in an attempt to get a cheap scare. I don't particularly hate or like jump scares. All I'm going to say is that while there are horror masterpieces that have jump scares, there is also something special about a no jump scare horror. The grunts of a red chomper aren't loud, but they are more terrifying than any jump scare. Darkwood imprints these sounds inside your head, adding to that lingering sense of fear once again. If there was a picture I could hear, it would probably be any screenshot from Darkwood. I know it sounds like a joke, but that is truly how memorable the sound design really is. It also greatly plays on the fear of the unknown. Like I noted, you always hear things before you see them, but sometimes you don't get to see them at all. The footsteps at night, the whispers, a mysterious creature opening and knocking on your door. There is nobody actually emitting these sounds, yet you don't truly know that, since what are you gonna do, go check? The sound design also works a perfect duet with the soundtrack, and it makes for an extremely atmospheric experience. Most of the time music only plays in the morning and when you're near characters or in a particular area. It stays silent at other times, which lets the ambience really shine. That also means that when there is music, it's all the more pleasant. It's kind of like a special thing. Oh, it's the morning, I'm safe. Hey, that's the Wolfman. And that's a place I shouldn't be in. It's incredibly memorable. Very rarely do I go listen to a game's soundtrack and can immediately recognize all of the songs, every single one. And of course, for the little that there is of it, is all masterfully composed. Regarding gameplay, I already gave my thoughts on the scavenging, so let's discuss the other aspects. You don't need to eat or drink, but there is a cooking process in the form of extracting essence from mushrooms, odd meat, red eggs, embryos, and other delicious foods native to every polished forest. Once you accumulate enough essence, you get a skill. There are a total of 13 skills spread out over 4 tiers. Some are obviously more vital than others, but all of them have their uses. Well, except math. It prevents you from using other skills for 45 seconds and doesn't even heal you to full in all that time. And it's also very unlikely that you'll be able to stand near an electric light source all of that time either, so you're not even gonna heal to its maximum value. Besides moth, you also have to choose another negative trait, and some of them hurt you quite a bit. You get to let off a bone-chilling scream in order to scare off enemies, but now you have to wait a little longer before your stamina starts recovering. The game is also only partially randomly generated. For example, the types of buildings and their quality is predetermined, but their locations are completely random. The shape of the map is also random, but there are only a couple of different handcraft layouts, and the items contained in crates throughout the map are random as well, yet those in buildings are not. But what does exploring this semi-random generated map encompass? Besides the no-eating part, the game also doesn't require you to cut down trees or mine for resources. You find everything simply laying in the soil waiting for you, or maybe even hidden in a broken tractor or tank. This scavenging is done with the purpose of crafting better items so you can scavenge more and craft even better items, and ultimately hoard as many resources as you can in order to progress into the next area. The 3 main zones, the Dry Meadow, the Silent Forest and the Old Woods, all encompass a fair share of unique locations and encounters to be explored and eventually conquered. Each of them also has a respective hideout in which you will be spending the entire night. And nights are, well, kind of terrifying. Sure, the first few are pretty chill, you get some spooky whispers and maybe a door opens, but they soon devolve into a terrifying tower defense kind of situation wherein you fight for your life every single sundown. It's up to you to come up with your own optimal strategy, though usually you will mostly be barring all the doors and windows, setting traps in front of them and waiting. If something enters, you kill it and bar it up again. Sometimes fighting cannot be avoided though. You might lack the wood and nails needed for barricading, you might lack scrap metal for traps, there might be too many enemies, and so on. And sometimes you're finding night events like hell-draining black fog or shadows. The fighting system is not complex, hard to master, or even particularly intriguing, at first glance at least. You have a wind-up hit which deals a good amount of damage and consumes little stamina. You have a fast hit which doesn't deal as much and consumes a huge amount of stamina. You can dodge if you want, enemies usually have 2 different attacks that dodge as well sometimes. It's very simple, but that simplicity coupled with the fact that you have such little health is largely the reason why it's so unforgiving. It's realistic, and that's what real fights are, unforgiving. You hit a dog with a shovel, it staggers a little bit, then you hit it again and now it's dead. If it manages to bite you a couple of times, now you're dead. If you have a shotgun though... In real life, nobody performs a bunch of fancy, masterful movements in order to avoid a series of carefully executed attacks. A guy comes at you swinging and there really isn't much you can do about it.
Well, you might... Whatever. Got overwhelmed.
Even simple tasks will start to exert pressure upon you because of this realism. You get tired fast when running. Opening your inventory takes time. Moving furniture is tedious and complicated to navigate. You are not playing a game, you are playing someone's unfortunate life. This is as good a time as any to get into the story, since there's not much else I can say about the aforementioned aspects without spoiling everything. Therefore, if you haven't played Darkwood yet are planning to eventually, please do so before proceeding with this section of the video. This game is best experienced blind. I'll have to begin with a short synopsis of the entire plot in order to introduce you to all the possible outcomes and the hidden elements of the story you might have missed altogether. A dark and abstract dream makes it clear that a plague is laying waste in a mysteriously closed-off polished forest. After waking up, you quickly realize that you are the one that's been tasked with eliminating said plague, and you're not doing so well. The house's floor is littered with notes and dirty rags, empty cages sit in the dark corners, and a pattern of bloodstains paints the floorboards. After rummaging through this mess, you realize you've run out of gasoline and decide to take a quick trip to a nearby broken tractor. It seems that your dog is on the verge of death. You can either ignore it or end its suffering. Making your way through the shrouded forest, you eventually stumble across an unconscious stranger in possession of a big metal key. You decide to take him back to your house and perhaps nurse him back to health like any proper doctor should? For some reason, you immediately conclude that he is not going to help you voluntarily and inject him with some kind of substance and proceed to beat him unconscious. Then the screen fades in and now you're playing as a stranger. Now, I was kind of disappointed at first that you don't get to play as the Doctor, since the name The Stranger does imply another one of those blank slate type of characters I hate so much. And in some ways, I admit he kind of is. However, the fact that he is a stranger is very important to the story. We'll discuss that later on. For now, we've got to escape this place. You smash the locked door and step out into the darkness, and an unsettling tension firmly envelops you as you begin making your way through the dim-lit house. You quickly begin to realize that something isn't quite right. It can't be. First you see a ghostly image of the Doctor, then a man with 2 dows instead of eyes, then transpires a short altercation with what seems to be a patient, or rather captive of the Doctor, who attacks you on sight, resulting in his death. He proceeds to continue speaking anyway. Eventually, everything goes completely wrong when this happens. You are then rescued by a mysterious hooded man. You also seem to have passed out on the outside, which, coupled with the oddness of the scenes we just witnessed, heavily suggests that you were hallucinating due to the Doctor's injection. The reason you are able to make your way out is perhaps thanks to what you perceive as Stygian monsters, but who were in fact a band of villagers raiding the Doctor's house, and thus giving you time to escape. The man that saves you from the Doctor, the trader, then drops you off at the Dry Meadow hideout. He proceeds to visit you there each morning. You conclude that your only escape is through some underground passage, to which the Doctor now has the key. Trotting to the quiet Dry Meadow, you come across another strange man, one not so hospitable and also bearing the head of a wolf. The wolf man offers quite the intriguing deal though. He promises to help us as long as we help him attend a certain matter, but he demands we prove our worth first by reaching what he dubs the Silent Forest. Continuing our journey, we also find the supposed underground entrance, albeit the door is locked. Much was expected. If we gaze into the keyhole, however, a speckled light can be seen emanating, and drowned out voices can be heard from the other side. Disappointed, we make our way back when a sudden earthquake pulls us back to our senses. After making your way to the Silent Forest, you meet up with the Wolfman, as promised. He quickly showers you with his manipulative camaraderie before bringing up the deal. All he wants from you is to visit the village and find the key to a locked room within the house of a certain despicable old lady, as he puts it. And then he'll help you retrieve what you've lost, a key for a key. He also suggests you go to the smaller village and kill the sow, an oversized mutated swine, albeit this is not mandatory. In the Silent Forest you also meet Piotrek, an aspiring space traveler who requires you to scramble about for his missing ship parts. If you manage to do it, he gives you a hefty reward before embarking for space. Presumably, of course. Visiting the main village, you make your acquaintance with the chicken lady and soon after the musician, a shy kid playing his violin outside the old woman's house. He claims that he's performing for the pretty lady, who is apparently locked within the chicken lady's house. The kid also begs you to retrieve the key for him. He even directs you to where you might find it. You then plunge into the village well and emerge inside a house in the southeastern edge of the village, wherein you finally retrieve the key. You then have two distinct choices. Firstly, you can choose to fulfill the Wolfman's request and bring him the key, after which he runs off, seemingly excited. You then meet up with him in the old woods, with him now covered in blood, yet still ecstatic. In his hideout, you find the half-devoured corpse of the pretty lady. Speaking with the Wolfman, he informs you of the Doctor's whereabouts and angrily banishes you from his forest, never to be seen again. Making your way to the Doctor's house, you find it ransacked, with the Doctor nowhere in sight. However, you find what is apparently his current hiding location, the train station, and there, surely enough, you find him. Whether you spare him, team up, or murder him, you eventually find yourself in front of the metal door once again. Behind it is a long tunnel riddled with decay and water. As you traverse it, you come across a man embedded in roots. He rambles on for some time before reaching into his own skull and pulling out a bullet. The man dies not long after, of course. As you proceed into the shrouded tunnel, you eventually reach the end and crawl out into a completely new area, a vile swamp infested with deadly mutated creatures. As you explore this horrid place, you run into the Doctor in many a different location, with his mental increasingly deteriorating each time. At the end, he is covering himself in mud in order to stick branches onto his head. Devoid of any sanity he once had, he is at the end left as an empty husk of a man turned feral and insane thanks to the forest's plague. Another familiar face you might run across if you killed the sow per the wolf's request and also spared the chicken lady will be the musician. He must have embarked with the villagers and made his way to the swamp. However, for some unknown reason, the kid has grown at a disturbing rate, and if you feed him a hallucinogen, he transforms into a large bloated creature much resembling his dear pretty lady. Here are the slight differences which occur if you gave the musician the key back in chapter 1. When presenting it to him, he will ask you to retrieve a violin from his parents' house and a drawing to gift them. There you find they have transformed into red chompers thanks to the plague. When you kill them and retrieve the violin, the musician concurs that his parents must no longer be angry at him for returning the violin, and informs you of the Doctor's whereabouts before seeking out his loving parents. If you return there once again, you find him openly weeping and refusing to talk to you for what you have done. On the contrary, you can leave the drawing he gives you next to the parents, and they will instead ignore you, letting you fetch the violin safely. Everything then plays out much the same, although if you visit the house again you discover the musician's dead body. He will help you either way, and with him being as gullible as he is, he actually sets up an appointment with the Doctor, which means he will be expecting you and therefore set up an ambush. He drugs you once again. You hallucinate some out-of-body experience, witnessing events from the Doctor's past relating to the plague. A black chomper attacks you, and if you die, you wake up with the Doctor nowhere in sight. If you survive, however, you get to make the choice much like in the Wolf's Path. During chapter 2, you will eventually discover your hideout's been riddled with muddy footsteps and partially ransacked. An angry note from the Wolfman remains, demanding you visit him at the sawmill to retrieve your goods. There, he orders you to leave your items outside so it's fair, after which the wolf sends 2 dogs after you. If you defeat them, he follows, spraying you with his AK. If you manage to kill him, he blurts out a couple of curses before collapsing dead, leaving you to reclaim your items. If you die, he lets you retrieve the items you left outside the room and not much else, except a gracious little gift consisting of a gramophone, a violin, and a sample of his shit. That's it for the differences. Either way, you will eventually make acquaintance with the Tree, a trio of silent half-savages who replace the trader in chapter 2. You also meet the Elephants, a mom and 2 children donning gas masks. The mother begs you to find her 3rd missing son. After digging through his possessions, you embark and track him down to a single house amidst the mushroom glade, wherein resides a lonely mushroom granny. You have 4 ways of approaching this. You can show her the drawings you found in the boy's room, after which she releases him so he can reunite with his family. If you killed the sow during chapter 1, she will ask you to deal with the villagers that have been bothering her lately, these villagers being the ones who managed to chop their way through the forest. You can either murder all of them or trap them inside the quarry, sealing them off from the swamp. If you lie to the granny and tell her that you dealt with them but in reality did not, they will barge into her house and eat her the following day. Alternatively, you can also opt for eating the old lady, obviously killing her in the process and therefore granting you the key to the locked room. After dragging the boy to his family, they reward you with one of their gas tanks and bid you farewell. In order to refill the tank, you first have to visit the junkyard and rummage about until you find the parts for fixing the compressor in the hideout. After refilling the oxygen tank, you visit the swamp village and meet an old, crippled and blind man. He levies his frustration for a certain talking tree and begs you to burn it down. Surely enough, you find this gross, moaning amalgamation of bodies further within the village, although the only way to destroy it is to burn its heart, which is apparently underneath it. So, you use the oxygen tank to dive into the muddy water and eventually reach the heart, which you set aflame before making your way out. As the comforting fire rages behind you, drowning out the tree's horrible cries, you spot the blind cripple staring right into the bright flames. The following morning, you make haste to the empty village, wherein the tree has finally been reduced to ash and a new path has opened up, a new road, the road home. Alternatively, you can opt for sparing the talking tree and instead venture into the radio tower. There you encounter a plethora of screeching banshees, and after making your way through them, you descend into a hatch wherein you shortly fall unconscious. Waking up, things seem a little different. A long, root-riddled corridor leads you to a small familiar room, which locks behind you the moment you step inside. After finally breaking out, you find yourself at the doctor's house, where you simply ought to escape as the black monsters swarm behind you. If you manage, you get to actually wake up. Down the newly opened hallway, a set of stairs leads you to a solitary field. An oven, a scarecrow, and once again, a road. The road home. Either way, this is the place you will end up at. As you walk along it, you gaze into the petrified corpses of the people who tried escaping the forest, and if you burn the talking tree, even the feeble cripple crawling on the pavement. Finally, you reach home. You greet your neighbors and retreat into the comforting depths of your old apartment bedroom, where you get to fall into a deep, much-deserved sleep. However, if you're more than ignorant, you likely realize that something isn't quite right. This untouched little city is maybe a mile away from an infested, demonic-plagued forest, and none of your neighbors know anything about it or comment on your deformed face or stained clothes. Strolling down the city, you start to notice that everything is repeating. Perhaps a depiction of the odd symmetry and overall uncanniness of Soviet blocks, but every single little detail is repeating as well. And you find a letter from your wife. How does she know you're coming back? No, something is wrong. You investigate the depths of the basement and find an ordinary radio which promptly tells you to go to sleep. On the first floor, the bikeman can be found laying on the ground. He asks you for change, and next to him is a metal door. Walking up the second floor, you stride down into an endless hallway overgrown with roots, and once finally retreating into your safe haven, an uneasy realization strikes you. You scramble about and find a large screwdriver, and with shaking hands you begin to pry off the flooring of your house, under which the roots have made home. You find a hole in the bedroom, and once you plunge inside, you briefly lose consciousness. Only then do you wake up from the dream, and find yourself in a sunken valley littered with the bodies of oblivious, blissful people. They're all gathered around the bright and velvet light, the being, basking in its overwhelming presence. Once again, you fell into the hallucinations of your mind. It whispered pleasant thoughts to you, those of home and rest. But home is no more. All roads lead deeper into the woods. And that is exactly what happened. The being lured you right in. You can succumb to the being's influence, upon which you fall into a euphoric sleep once again, dreaming of home and family, until you eventually starve to death and are consumed by it. But there is one more possibility. You can reject the being and pull your gaze away from it. In a fit of rage, you find a man you recognize. He's the one from your research team. But that is of no importance. You forcefully take the flamethrower away from him and set ablaze the being and the blissful valley of roots. Your attempts of escape will inevitably prove futile. Such is the price. For the being to be destroyed, everything must be consumed by the fire. Here are the various character outcomes. Some are pretty expansive, so I will be narrating them pretty quickly. Feel free to pause and read the whole thing, since some of them are quite intriguing. I will only be clarifying when the burn them all or true ending is what's required to get a particular outcome, since you can deduce that if it's not that, then it's the false ending. If you follow the musician's path and kill the sow, the chicken lady starves to death thanks to the villagers who eat her chickens. Her sister, the pretty lady, then eats her corpse. And if you spare the sow, the musician saves her sister, whatever that means. Killing the musician's parents and the chicken lady's sister will lead to the both of them bonding over their losses. And if you do the same but the musician dies as well, she simply falls into a deep depression. In the wolf's path, the chicken lady embarks in a search for her missing sister, dying in the process. In the burn them all ending, if the pretty lady is alive, she dies trying to carry her sister out, and if she is already dead, then she will let herself perish too. If the pretty lady got kidnapped by the wolf, she dies much the same in the woods. On unknown conditions, the pretty lady can eventually break free, then hunt down the musician and eat him. The musician listens to the forest's rumbles if left alone, and hears his mother's voice in them if she is killed. If he returns to his parents' house, they eat him alive, and it is the pretty lady who consumes him if he gets to her. In case of the wolf's path and the sow's death, he embarks into the underground after you leave him, and if you fed him hallucinogens, he grows to monstrous proportions. If you opt for the burn them all ending, he dies by the flames, otherwise he waits them out underneath the trapdoor. The elephant's mom will lock the runaway child up if you bring him back, leading Mushroom Granny to fall into a deep slumber, which eventually turns her into a patch of mushrooms. If you leave him alone, he lives out the rest of his life with the grandma while his mom is looking for him, with unknown repercussions. And during the burn them all ending, the kid will embark on a search for his family, and if they're already reunited, they all perish together. The Mushroom Granny will die either way. If you burn the talking tree, the cripple gets consumed by the fire, and if you spare it, he either descends into madness or feasts his eyes upon its death during the burn them all ending. If you got killed in the train wreck dream, the doctor is driven to the edge of madness due to his fear of your revenge, yet eventually accepts his life in the forest. He is haunted by the thoughts of his daughter during the respective burn them all ending. If the latter ending is crossed with the wolf's path, he dies in a euphoric sleep. If you ignore a pure trek, he never fulfills his dreams of space travel, but if you release the flames, he uses his puny makeshift rocket as a hiding spot. If you help him complete his real rocket, he kills himself trying to fly away with it, and you can find his corpse at the junkyard. If you give the parts to our kind wolfman, he sabotages the rocket and detonates him. If you ignore the snail, he breaks free and gets to gaze bewilderedly into his reflection, since hitherto he somehow must have not been made aware of his appearance. If you free him on the other hand, he gets stuck in the forest and sees his reflection again, moments before his demise of course. In the burn them all ending, he, burns to death. The talking tree continues to seal off the inhabitants if left undisturbed, and if burned, opens up the road for the many residents of Darkwood, with only the tree lamenting over its death. In the true ending, it perishes either way, with the tree also dying with it. If not approached, the wolfman lives out his life basking in the misery of the forest's inhabitants. If his wish is fulfilled, he consumes the pretty lady, then proceeds to chase his own trail for an eternity, or so is the hearsay. If he manages to steal the stranger's loot and get away with it, that leaves him fulfilled for a while, but not as long as getting his deepest desire, the pretty lady. In the true ending, his fate is left to speculation. The villagers live happily ever after if you simply fix their cables. If you kill the sow as well and ignore the Mushroom Granny, they presumably turned to savages after roaming the swamp. If you meet the granny but let the villagers live, they pay her a visit, kill and eat her, then likely turn to some form of mutated monster. They take the boy if he is present. If nobody is present at the house, they simply eat it whole, and if you trap the villagers inside the quarry, they eventually manage to break out. In the burn them all ending, they apparently get rescued by helicopters if the sow is spared. If it's killed, however, they end up eating Granny's mushrooms and go insane, throwing themselves into the flames. They inevitably burn to death as well if trapped inside the quarry. And finally, if you killed every single inhabitant of the woods, this is the parting message. From then on, wooden crosses covered with a coat and a hat started appearing in the woods. They were usually accompanied by 3 black, beakless dead crows. The inhabitants of the woods believed these symbols protected them from a scarecrow lurking between the trees, silently taking the lives of everyone he encountered. And the vagabond from outside the woods, the monster in a scarecrow's disguise, who, due to reasons only known to himself, killed everyone who crossed him. Before analyzing the plot, I'd like to offer the rest of my commentary on the gameplay, now that spoilers are not an issue. The prologue, to be exact. The Doctor's Side introduces the attack mechanic in a pretty unique way by making you murder your dog, though it also makes you chop through a barrier of wood, which I find weird since you don't do that anywhere else in the game. On your short journey for gasoline, you also learn about all the kinds of wonderful aspects of Darkwood. The bear traps, the crafting, or the fantastic way the map works, which is by only highlighting your location if you're near a landmark. The Stranger's Prologue on the other side teaches you the other mechanics like looting, lockpicking, filling a generator, fighting, and dying. And we learn it all in a very subtle and clever way as well. However, this short sequence of events is not only a little tutorial section for the gameplay, but also a lesson on Darkwood's horror, the limit of vision. Nothing really scary happens for the first minute or so, and yet that tension holds tight through the fear that something could happen. Even though you haven't played the game yet, it's only an instinct to feel uneasy in the darkness. It's also masterfully laid out. You start a new game and 3 minutes later you're fully immersed and feel like you've been playing this game for years and know exactly what to do. Here are also my short thoughts on hard mode. Maybe this is just me, but I found it not as exciting after finishing the game once. I already spoke about it a ton and will try not to repeat the same stuff again, but in short, it doesn't feel like the stakes are high the second time around. I've already seen everything in the majority of the story. There isn't much for me to lose if I die and the game ends. Will it be a bummer if I do? Yes. Is it scary? No. Is it technically a good mode for a second playthrough? Yes. Can I divorce it from the idea that it could have been a better first run mode? No. Does it ruin the experience somewhat? Yes. Through a lot of environmental storytelling, documents, items, and dialogue between otherwise unimportant villagers, we can deduce the backstory of Darkwood. It all seems to have started in August 1975, when a bright object fell from the sky, presumably the being. It brought forth a plague which infected many a resident of the forest and caused the trees to grow to an astounding rate. The government first tried to contain it by burning infected livestock and houses, but these attempts proved futile, leading them to close off the area. It proved unnecessary in the long run as the forest soon began closing off on its own anyway. This forced them to construct a series of underground tunnels through which the research teams would enter, with you being part of the last one. Anyone trying to escape through the tunnels got shot down. The last research team that visited Darkwood had their camp invaded by savages, and every single one of them was murdered, except the protagonist. He somehow managed to escape his bindings and, for reasons unknown, swapped his clothes for a scarecrow's before making his way to the old woods, and eventually collapsing. What follows is well known. Pertaining to the effects of the plague, it somehow notably inflicts a slow kind of mutation. Varying levels of body deformity, hair loss, headaches which split the skull, and eventually falling into a deep slumber, during which the body undergoes the complete and final transformation, as can be seen with the villagers. When it comes to mental deterioration, however, things get much more severe. The organism loses its desire for sleep or food, and rather opts for the many grotesque foodstuffs native to Darkwood. They suffer from hallucinations and a decrease in vocal ability, developing a sort of primal, spiritual, ritualistic behavior in which you cover your face with mud and attach sticks to yourself, construct ritual sites, and draw symbols and/or patterns. Weirdly enough, what seems to be the mental aspect of the plague somewhat affects the physical as well, since the organism not only loses its desire for sleep or food, but also its need. Regardless, these two types of the plague, the mental and the physical, seem to be completely incompatible. The musician and the trader are both greatly deformed, but their mental seems to be in check. Meanwhile, the doctor can go completely insane without suffering any bodily mutations whatsoever. Thus, this mental deterioration is a symptom in and of itself, and not caused by the physical. One of the cases in which a character is afflicted both physically and mentally is the Pretty Lady, although you could make the argument that her body is likely the only thing directly affected by the plague, and her mind is screwed simply due to the long exposure of mental stress she suffered, which no other character seems to have been exposed to. The other case is actually the protagonist. He suffers from hallucinations, craving for mushrooms, and perhaps even a loss of speech, yet he is also, albeit not to an astounding rate, somewhat deformed. The plague at first also seems to have varying levels of severity, with some characters being afflicted more than others. However, it's more likely that they're just in a different stage, albeit there are undoubtedly different final outcomes. When it comes to mental deterioration, these are the varying levels of insanity. And for the physical deformities, this seems to be the case. There are characters unafflicted by the plague, however. The elephants, for one, have managed to escape the plague due to their gas masks and trusty old cottage. We confirm this when gazing upon the third child, who simply has some mental instabilities, likely caused by living in the mushroom hut. On the other hand, we have the bike man. He has the sanity of the average alcoholic, but is a shining specimen of mental health compared to the other residents of Darkwood. He is perfectly capable of speech, rationale, and is even particularly witty at times. And when it comes to his body, his only real problem is some perfectly natural hair loss. This leads me to believe that he has yet to contract the plague, and the only reason I can think of why he has not yet is his avid alcohol consumption. The final type of, you might say, afflicted individual is the replica. One of the weirdest phenomena occurring within Darkwood is that of imperfect replication. This happens as the substance controlled by the being tries to take on the form of something, resulting in an object constructed with the faulty capabilities it has. The most obvious example of this is the trader. When we find his dead body in the swamp hideout, he has on him what seem to be replicas of the tunnel key in our journal, which means he's a replica of us. It might explain his naturally hospitable treatment of the protagonist as well. He is also fused together with his helmet, which hints to the idea that the being is, to an extent, mindless and cannot distinguish between creatures and objects. However, it has cloned what was likely an object, the corpse of a man, in the form of an imperfect replica of a living person, which might mean it actually does recognize what is a person and what is not. If this happened while the original man was still breathing, however, that would obviously be way different. Another example is our dear Wolfman. Something's obviously wrong with his form, but the major evidence is his wedding ring, in fact, which is a poor imitation of that found upon the man in the Hunter's Lodge. He shares similarities with the usual hunter, a love for guns and trophies, and with this specific one, the pretty lady, who seems to have once been married to him, indicated by their matching rings. And of course, the most important case, the trees themselves. The research team estimated that only 15% of them are actual trees, perhaps alluding to the fact that they seem to grow so fast. Other examples include Mushroom Granny's house, Mushroom Granny herself, the snail, and the talking tree. Dreams, or rather nightmares, are mostly experienced after taking a dosage of the substance. This is first witnessed in the prologue, after the doctor gives you your first shot, although it is slightly different than future ones. We are dreaming in a way, but really hallucinating, since the things we witness are later proven to have actually happened. We actually killed Janek. Something did in fact break into the doctor's house, and we somehow ended up on the outside, which wouldn't have happened if we were asleep. All the other dreams depict events, with some being from the past and others from the future, but almost all of them are more like visions rather than dreams, since they are not something the protagonist can know of. For example, the first real dream, which depicts the Valley of Sleeping Men and the Being, or the visions of the Doctor's past, wherein you witness the pretty lady even if you haven't met her before. Black chompers are another recurring theme within the dreams. At first glance, I thought they were perhaps humans at the last stage of transformation, since they are perfectly capable of speech still, but they are also way stronger than red chompers, which leads me to believe they're simply able to speak because they're in a dream. Either way, we already concluded that they were for sure human at one time. Now, I hate myself for doing this, and you likely will as well, but these dreams kind of share a similarity with Lovecraft's ideas on dreaming. In H.P. Lovecraft's dream cycle, he explores the concept of alternative dimensions that can only be entered through dreams, where people can live in and meet each other. In the church dream in Darkwood, you encounter a black chomper, and if he survives, you can meet him in the physical world in the church, where he will actually make snide remarks about your previous encounter. However, the developers did say that none of them had read Lovecraft before making Darkwood, and either way, this is too insignificant of a detail. Still, it proves that these are something more than the usual dreams we experience in the real world. And now I'd like to say a few things about the various inspirations of Darkwood. The most apparent thing that's been mentioned by everyone is that it's a dark fairy tale, and it's pretty much spot on. All the characters have titles instead of names, well, except for Putrek, weirdly. Their outcomes are also very comedic and, for lack of vocabulary, fair-tale-y? Tell me, does this not sound fair-tale-y to you? The Wolfman then decided to help the stranger, only if he could help him satisfy his everlasting hunger. After getting his pretty lady, he chased his own tail until the end of time. The game doesn't seem to have been inspired by a particular fairy tale, but rather from fairy tales as a whole. Anyway, I won't dwindle on it anymore, as everyone's pretty much said the same thing already. The developers mentioned in an interview that a huge inspiration for the storytelling style of Darkwood were the Souls games, and it's hard to miss the resemblance. While there are major events that you witness during the game's plot, a lot of other important moments are presented through environment, items, documents, and dreams. So I guess we can say Darkwood is the Dark Souls of horror games. Another word that gets constantly thrown out by obnoxious people is Lovecraftian. I already mentioned the developers made it clear they weren't inspired by Lovecraft, but there are still some very interesting similarities, right? Well, no, not really. Besides the particular dream I mentioned and the fact the being somewhat resembles a particular mindless and oblivious deity from the Cthulhu mythos, both in character and appearance, there really isn't much else. There are games based on Lovecraft's stories, there are those which are clearly Lovecraftian, some have Lovecraftian elements incorporated into their lore, and others simply reference elements from the Cthulhu mythos, but there isn't any of that in Darkwood. I mean, you can even kill the all-powerful being, which is absolutely unheard of in Lovecraft's stories. I've seen others compare it to Beksinski, and I don't really see it. While Beksinski has portrayed people merging with objects and explored the idea of trees, I see no other clear correlation. To me, what seems like the incredibly obvious inspiration for this depressing Eastern European game is, well, other Eastern European games. Stalker, or as some might know it, the Strugatsky Brothers' Roadside Picnic, or perhaps the movie adaptation, Pathologic, or the remake Pathologic 2, or the Metro trilogy and the novels it was based on. A bunch of peculiar Slavic individuals in a closed-off paranormal area where the environment is to an extent presented as a character, and some ultimate threat, be it a plague or radiation, is always looming over our questionable anti-hero cast of characters. Whether Darkwood was directly inspired by these games, ended up being similar due to the developers all growing up in a similar culture, or it was simply a coincidence, I'm going to leave to your interpretation. But I am going to nudge you slightly towards one of these conclusions. Now, I'm not going to try and convince you that the being is a metaphor for communism, however, there are some interesting details nonetheless. The Wolfman can be seen as a depiction of a corrupt Eastern European cop. He thinks he owns the place, gets incredibly frustrated if you don't comply, and always has that passive-aggressive tone which hints at "I could turn a blind eye, but it comes at a price." His name is even a play on words which means cop. A good amount of the residents of Darkwood seem to hate outsiders, which, no matter what others say, is a shared belief among many Eastern European people, with some openly stating, "Yeah, I really just don't like Turkish or Romani people." This behavior is usually exhibited, much like in the real world, by less educated people like the villagers, or otherwise simply demented and questionable individuals such as the doctor or the aforementioned Wolfman. It is in some ways different, however, since the protagonist doesn't come from a different country per se, but it's still an interesting parallel and maybe just portrayed on a smaller scale so it can fit with the plot of the game. The last concept I can think of is that of escaping a place and venturing onto a better location, much like leaving a village and moving into a big town. And if we were to do a little bit of stretching, leaving your Slavic home country and emigrating to the west. Alright, we summarized the whole plot, gave a brief backstory of the whole event, analyzed all of the various elements, also relating to different Eastern European games and even real-life Slavic cultural inspirations and parallels. But what does it all mean? What is the being? Well, we don't really know. and I think that's for the better. While I do try to explain everything I can about the game's plot, it does make it incredibly intriguing when something can't be explained. That being said, here is what I think the being is. The being first came from the sky, like we said, indicating that it's some sort of extraterrestrial cosmic entity. It also seems to be to an extent mindless. It cannot communicate very clearly, it fails to distinguish between a creature and an object, it wants people to come to it and yet conjure the talking tree which blocks the way towards it, and it's also portrayed as a young child, and children are, well, not as smart as non-children. However, the reason we perceive it as mindless, to our standards at least, might be due to the fact that it is extraterrestrial. We always like to imagine that if aliens existed, they would be pretty similar to us. They also have limbs, but they're kind of weird. They have eyes, but they're bigger. They communicate through speech, but it's kind of quirky sounding. But if they really did exist, they'd be so far away from Earth and in such different conditions that they would kind of have to be drastically different than us. We perceive this entity as mindless, since it has different ways of communicating than us, different goals, different ways of fulfilling them. We cannot even comprehend its true form, so all we see is a giant blinding light. It's so different from us that we cannot physically apply our judgment to it, since it seems to act randomly, and therefore we cannot even comprehend it. We don't know what it means, and that's why it's so terrifying. And finally, after answering that ultimate question, kind of, we arrive at the true ultimate question. What do I think of Darkwood? Darkwood is one of the most unique games that I've ever played, and definitely up there when it comes to my favorite horror titles. If you somehow ended up at this section of the video without playing the game, I ask you why and how, but I'll also ask you that to play the game. It's $475 on Steam at the time of writing this video. Does the game have issues? Yes, I think I made that very clear. But is it a great game nonetheless? Absolutely. I hereby congratulate you if you made it this far. You get nothing. I hope the video was enough. It was quite the effort on my part, the script alone took 60 hours to write, but I had a lot of fun and I hope you did too. Here are some other great Darkwood videos you might want to check out if you're interested in some different outlooks. I have no idea when the next video will be coming out, but it's going to be at least as long as this one and probably more. As always, subscribe if you like this type of content and want to see more of it. Thank you for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next video.